Good afternoon, colleagues, and thank you for joining us. I am Dr. Shanti Singh Anthony, Knowledge Coordinator for the Pan-Caribbean Partnership Against HIV and AIDS PANCAP, based at the PANCAP Coordinating Unit in Georgetown, Guyana. Let me extend a really warm welcome to you on behalf of PANCAP's Director, Mr. Derek Springer, and thank you in advance for joining us on this webinar, which is a collaborative effort between PANCAP and the Pan American Health Organization. This afternoon, we will continue to share updates from the recently concluded 10th International AIDS Society Conference on HIV Science in Mexico. At this point, before I proceed further, I'd like to share a few housekeeping notes with you. Firstly, your mics are muted, and so if you have any questions, I ask that you type these in as the webinar progresses. We will take your questions at the end of the presentation. Secondly, we're recording this webinar and we'll post the recording on PANCAP's website and social media platforms for the benefit of the wider PANCAP partnership. And finally, you'll receive in your email a post-webinar evaluation. I encourage you to complete and share your thoughts and impressions. This will really be useful to us as we enhance our future webinar experiences. So this is the third webinar in this series, presenting updates from the International AIDS Conference on HIV Science in Mexico City. Our presenter this afternoon is Dr. Nandita Sugandhi. She is a pediatrician with over 10 years of experience working in HIV pediatric care and treatment. After completing her training in New York in 2006, she spent 4 years working with the Baylor International Pediatric AIDS Initiative to provide clinical care to HIV-positive children in Swaziland, Botswana, Tanzania, and India. From 2010 to 2017, she worked with the Clinton Health Access Initiative as a senior clinical advisor to improve access to essential drugs and diagnostics for HIV prevention and treatment in resource-limited settings. She is currently a senior staff associate at ICAP at Columbia University. Dr. Sugandhi also leads the Optimal Pediatric ARV Formulation Subcommittee, as well as a technical advisory panel for pediatric AIDS treatment for Africa, a network of over 250 clinics in sub-Saharan Africa dedicated to providing high-quality pediatric care. Dr. Nandita certainly brings a lot of experience and expertise to us this afternoon as she presents on pediatric HIV treatment optimization, a changing landscape. I now hand you over to Dr. Nandita.
Shanti, thank you so much, and thank you all for joining in this afternoon. As Shanti mentioned, I'm a pediatrician by training, but my focus has really been on pediatric ARV formulations, and I wanted to share with you some of the updates coming up. Let's see, I'm trying to move the slides here. Here we go. Okay. So what I was actually hoping that I could learn from all of you. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion section. But what I'd like to review quickly is sort of the background and rationale for optimization for children, as well as give you an update on the new WHO 2019 recommendations for ART. And then we'll sort of quickly review some of the new pediatric ARV formulations that are available, and we'll talk about the optimal formulary and limited use list, which is sort of a strategy to make sure that for low volume products, we make sure that they're still available, and how to transition between transition to new recommendations. And then hopefully we'll be able to open it up for a productive discussion. So just to get going, some of you may have heard about the PEPFAR-supported FEAR project, which is a population-based HIV impact assessment. And it really measures the progress countries and regions are making towards UNAIDS 90-90-90 goals. And this helps with sort of shaping our policy and funding priorities. So this was a household level survey that offered HIV testing and counseling, as well as asked questions about the availability and access to treatment and preventative services for both adults and children. So here we have, there's a map in the upper right-hand corner, which shows the FIA countries that have completed their surveys or are completing their surveys to date. Most of them have been in sub-Saharan Africa, though, as you may be able to see from the map, it's kind of cut off there, but there is an ongoing survey in Haiti. But what we see from the data on children 0 to 14 years of age is that we really see a gap in the first and third 90 for children. So we want to get to 90, and we have a few months left. And really, we're looking at the orange bars here shows those that are diagnosed. The gray bars show those are on treatment. And again, you'll see in most countries that bar, the second 90, is quite high. Largely due to the adoption of test and start policies. But then when we look at viral load suppression, it's really quite low. When we go to measuring the viral suppression, and this is what I want to focus on here, is comparing the results from adults versus children, and this is children 0 to 14. And so those are the bars on the left-hand side of those that, the yellow bars on the left-hand side, and then on the adults on the right-hand side. And what you can see is, even though we have relatively low coverage of children, at this point maybe about half of all children eligible for ART are not on it, but even of those children who have been initiated, only slightly more than half of those children in those countries have viral load suppression. But you compare this to adults, and you see that there's a huge disparity here, with 86% of adults on treatment attaining and achieving viral load suppression. So this is actually, though that number represented the children who were actually on treatment, if we look at the low numbers of children on treatment, as well as the low rates of viral suppression, this graph shows you that overall, among all children living with HIV, we have very low rates of viral load suppression. So we not only need to find and initiate these children, but we need to make sure they have optimal regimens. And if we actually pool the percentage of viral load suppression across these countries, it only comes out to 37%. So again, we have quite a way to go. And I know I'm presenting data that largely comes from sub-Saharan Africa, but there are countries that have contributed to more information on drug resistance surveillance. And so this is from the WHO HIV drug resistance report that was recently launched at the IAS conference in Mexico City. And you can see there were a number of countries from the region that contributed data. And so you can see here that the bars here represent pre-treatment drug resistance. So those that are treatment naive among first-line initiators by country and also by drug. And as you can see here, there are very high rates of nevirapine and efavirenz resistance, as well as emerging resistance to tenofovir and 3TC. So this is not pediatric specific data, but it is across the population. Next, I pulled out some of the information specific to the region. And one thing I want to note here is the survey year. And as we have expansion of ART treatment, I do think we are seeing more resistance emerge. But what I wanted to bring your attention to here is that when we look at the prevalence of NNRTI pre-treatment drug resistance, we really see that in a few countries, it's really the women that are that have higher rates of resistance, in some countries higher than 30%, and this is pre-treatment. And so here, actually, the WHO started a drug resistance survey among infants newly diagnosed with HIV to look at pre-treatment drug resistance in in infants, and again, these are largely from sub-Saharan African countries. But what we can see here is the blue bars represent all the infants that have been diagnosed. The purple bars represent those that had been exposed to ARVs through PMTCT, and the green bars show that the infants that did not have a history of any PMTCT or exposure to ARVs, or the information was unknown. And again, you can see from just looking at the dates that our coverage of PMTCT has increased. But as that has increased, those children that remain that still become infected do have high rates, up to 80, almost 70, 80%. Even before they've started. So this, we usually talk about the third drug, the NNRTIs, but I also wanted to point out that we have to think about the NRTIs as well. So this is from that same survey that was done, and again, it looked across a number of countries at resistance patterns to look at patterns of resistance to NRTIs. And again, we can see that, almost 20% in some cases of children have resistance to any NRTI. The green bars actually show 3TC or FTC, which is most likely M184V. Now that is something that we tend to expect early on in resistance, but what's surprising here is that we see some resistance mutations to abacavir, AZT, zidovudine, and tenofovir, which is worrisome. So I do want to call attention to the fact that it's not just that third drug, the NNRTIs, that we're thinking about, but it's also the NRTI backbone. So despite kind of this information that's been emerging in our recognition that resistance is really is emerging and a growing threat to viral load suppression, when we look at what our policies have been and what our practice has been, we see that we still have quite a long way to go. So this is from the WHO Global ARV Use Survey. This was the most recent report that was released. And here you can see this is the percentage of children that are on these different regimens across all of the countries that report to the WHO. And only about half of them are on the recommended NRTI backbone of abacavir 3TC, and the majority of younger children are taking NNRTIs. And so here we have, as of 2016, the recommended regimens for children were abacavir 3TC, lopinavir, ritonavir for younger children, and abacavir, efavirenz, and 3TC for older children. But at this point, several years later, we are only at 50% of those children on these regimens, and the rest on suboptimal regimens. So really, our transition to new regimens has been slow, and what we have been working on is sharing information about the new guidelines and what recommendations to follow and what is available, but also more attention to the transition process to sort of, we're hoping that the next time we show this graph, it will look different. So what we really need are new treatment options for children. And this is what we mean by optimization. So we want ARVs that are efficacious, that have low toxicity, that are well tolerated and easy to take, that have a high genetic barrier to resistance, so we don't have this ongoing emergence of drug resistance, that give us better sequencing and switching options, and that are harmonized across populations. So this includes pregnancy, patients having TB, and again, harmonizing pediatrics with adults is also and so it is something that's of growing interest. And I have a little asterisk here by reducing cost. And partly this is because when you look at the number of pediatric patients that need treatment, it is it's a drop in the bucket compared to what we spend on adults. And so I think the cost of treatment is definitely a factor. But when thinking through this at a program level, the number of kids, I think that the cost should not be as much of the issue as these other factors. And so this is sort of what we think of as the most optimal ARV if they check these boxes. So moving on to the WHO recommendations, the recommendations really focus on moving away from NNRTI-based regimens in all populations introducing DaliaTen as soon as possible and using the most potent non-NNRTI option available. So again, that means protease inhibitors or integrase inhibitors. So at this point, we have moved away from looking at different, we still categorize it by different age groups, but we have recommendations for neonates as well, so as well as children. And here you can see that the preferred first line for neonates is zidovudine 3-TC and raltegravir. And for children, it's abacavir, 3-TC, and dolutegravir. And this may be a little confusing to see this as the preferred regimen, but this is when you start to look at the fine print. And what you can see here is that those neonates that start on raltegravir should be transitioned to an LPVR solid formulation as soon as possible. In terms of dolutegravir, the recommendation now is to make sure that it's preferred for those age and weight groups that have approved dolutegravir dosing. And at this point in time, that means 50 milligram tablets can be used from children weighing 20 kilos or more, and the adult formulation of TLD, or tenofovir, lamivudine, and dolutegravir, can be used in adolescents weighing more than 30 kilos. But if we don't have dolutegravir for the youngest children, and in many cases, raltegravir is not widely available. And so the alternative for neonates is nevirapine. And we have a few different alternatives for children. The first, and I think the preferable option, being abacavir, 3-TC, and LPVR. Now, raltegravir could be used as an alternative, but that's really if LPVR solid formulations are not available. And this is partly due to concern about the development of integrase inhibitor resistance, because raltegravir has a lower genetic barrier to resistance, but also because it's not widely available. It's not available in a generic formulation, and it's quite costly for programs. Now, if you look to the last recommendation, this was new in 2019. This was not included in the 2018 guidelines, but it was newly introduced, is that TAF-based regimens with dolutegravir are considered an alternative. And again, this is for those age and weight groups that have approved TAF dosing. And again, at this point, the adult dose of TAF can be used in children weighing 25 kilos or more, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the session. And lastly, we have the special circumstances, and these are really sort of your last-ditch efforts where there are no other alternatives available. So going through the sequencing options, that has also changed. We're starting with first line that is more durable, has a higher genetic barrier to resistance, but we also have more options. And so the recommendations are for those children who are starting on an LPVR containing regimen, that they should transition to an integrase inhibitor based regimen, namely dolutegravir for those that have dolutegravir formulation and dosing. But even those that fail on an NNRTI based regimen can also switch to an integrase inhibitor based second line. Now the question comes up, if we're using integrase inhibitors and third line, what should be the second line? And there's some debate about this, but the WHO recommends to transition to, switch to a second line containing a boosted PI. And this, of course, is with an optimized NRTI backbone. So that if they're started on AZT, that their second line would be abacavir, and if they start on abacavir, their second line would be tenofovir. And third line really still is, we're not yet at a public health approach, but there are studies looking at the combination of darunavir and dolutegravir with or without an optimized NRTI backbone. So really, what's new in the guidelines? At this point, there's a recommendation for dolutegravir containing regimens for all infants and children who are 4 weeks and older when the dosing and formulations are available. We also have raltegravir granules for neonatal treatment, lopinavir, ritonavir, or raltegravir for alternative first line in infants and children when dolutegravir is not available, and really restricting the use of NNRTI-based regimens for special circumstances when there's no other alternative. There's also a recommendation for dolutegravir or raltegravir containing second line after first line failure, or using a boosted PI after failure on an integrase inhibitor. And lastly, there's a new interest, there's always been interest, but there's kind of a new recommendation now for TAF-containing regimens. And like dolutegravir, it's for those children and infants who have, when the dosing and the formulations become available. I'm going to move a little more quickly now because I don't want to run out of time, but just going through some of the pediatric formulations. I'm going to start with the raltegravir granules, which actually have been around for quite a while, but in November of 2017, the FDA actually approved and expanded the indication of raltegravir to include full-term neonates weighing at least 2 kilos. And so this really gives us a stronger or a more potent option for those infants that are diagnosed shortly after birth. So this is being considered for use in those programs that are including birth testing, though I have to add there's not yet recommendations for those that are the very low birth weight infants less than 2 kilos. That said, I will say that the instructions for administering raltegravir granules are a little bit complicated, and the weight changes or the dosing changes quite frequently in the first few weeks of life. And so I think there's really a need to look at how effective and how feasible delivering raltegravir granules will be in a public health setting to neonates. We also have had raltegravir chewable tablets, and they've been FDA approved for those children over 2 years and weighing more than 10 kilos. So there's a 100 milligram scored tablet as well as a 25 milligram tablet, and these are both chewable. That said, for younger children, there was actually some work done to demonstrate that those chewable tablets can actually be dispersed in liquid. So as opposed to being fully chewed, they can be mixed in with liquid. We can't call them dispersible because they don't meet the strict definition that the FDA has for chewable or for dispersible tablets, but they can be dispersed in water or breast milk or any other beverage. So the WHO now endorses the use of chewable tablets for those infants from 4 weeks and 3 kilos onwards. So again, this gives us an alternative to dolutegravir if you want to use an integrase inhibitor-based regimen. That said, I also want to point out that the dosing is not equivalent across the different formulations. So the chewable tablets have a different bioequivalence, the granules, and the adult tablets. So there's really not a way to kind of doctor up a dose based on the wrong formulation. But we do have WHO recommendations now for dosing children across all the weight bands from 3 kilos using the 25 and then the 100 milligram chewable tablet. Now, DTG or dolutegravir is the drug that everybody is talking about and interested in, and that was a major part of the conference. So I'm sure everyone's heard quite a bit about it. At this point, the FDA has approved the use of dolutegravir in children. In the FDA, it's over 30 kilos, and the European Medicines Administration has approved it in children more than 6 years and 15 kilos. Though that said, there was recently some work done to demonstrate that a 50 milligram dose, the adult dose once daily in children over 20 kilograms, is safe and effective. So the WHO now endorses the use of 50 milligrams or the adult dose of dolutegravir for children who weigh at least 20 kilograms. And this is very new, but the FDA has also approved this. Now, TLD, the adult formulation of tenofovir, lamivudine, and dolutegravir, can be used in children 30 kilos and up. And again, this really reduces the age at which we can start to harmonize pediatric treatment with adult treatment. Dolutegravir is currently available in a 50 milligram adult tablet, which is also available as a generic product, as well as 25 and 10 milligram film-coated tablets. Now, the 25 and 10 milligram tablets need to be combined in different ways to make up the dosing that's currently approved by the EMA and the former FDA dosing, but But we do have some ongoing work now to develop a 5 milligram dispersible tablet. So the innovator company ViiV is developing that to be able to use across all the weight bands. And there's shortly after, we hope to have a generic 10 milligram score dispersible tablet. Additionally, there's work to develop a pediatric fixed dose combination of abacavir 3cc and dolutegravir, but that may be a couple years away. So when we don't have dolutegravir-based regimens, our second option has been lopinavir-ritonavir. And again, abacavir 3cc, lopinavir-ritonavir has been the preferred first-line regimen for younger children for many years. Now, the problem with this is the formulation that we had that was appropriate for infants and young children has been Kaletra syrup, or LPVR syrup. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but it's a difficult formulation to give. It requires a cold chain. There's a very bitter taste. It has toxic excipients. It can be heavy for caregivers to carry all these bottles, and it's hard to store. So these were the previous. This was the previously the even though LPVR has been the preferred option, we still saw at the end of 2017 that the majority of young children are still on nevirapine-containing regimens. But we actually have a new option, or two new options, for better formulations. We now have the LPVR oral pellets, which were approved in 2015, as well as the LPVR granules. And here at the top, on the top upper side, you can see a bottle and what the pellets look like, as well as below you can see the granules. And so they're both in a 40 milligram, 10 milligram dosage form, and so they're equivalent in terms of dose and can be dosed across all weight bands from 3 kilos. From 3 kilos onwards. Though that said, due to the pellet size, it's not recommended to use these in children younger than 3 months, though the granules, being a smaller particle size, can be used from 2 weeks onward. Now, we've had the pellets for 2015, and this is kind of what we used to call LPVR sprinkles. And again, sprinkles is not the technical term, but I do think that this is what people think of when they talk about it. And even though these were approved and introduced in some countries in 2015, a few years ago, it's really only now that we've started to scale this up in country. And part of the issue was that this is a difficult formulation to work with, and there were a lot of manufacturing constraints that limited the ability to scale up. Though recently there's been quite a bit of effort to work with the manufacturers of both of these formulations in order to improve the supply availability and demand for these products. And so, you know, the supply of pellets or granules are now much less of a constraint for country programs. And in addition to the new formulations themselves, there's also more resources available, given that these are formulations that aren't typically used. I think this is a very new way of giving different formulations. They have to be, the pellets and the granules have to be administered in a particular way. And also this issue around supply security is one that the ARV procurement working group has been very heavily invested in. And again, this is a group that looks to the rational procurement of not just LPVR, but all pediatric formulations or low volume formulations. ICAP has also developed new counseling materials to support the administration of pellets, another set to support the administration of granules, and a third on teaching children to swallow tablets. And this last one is because, as we know, it's not advisable to crush or chew or break the LPVR heat stable tablets, and you know that also includes the pellets. And so what would be optimal would be to switch children to start them on a formulation that's easier to swallow, but over time switch them to the tablets. But we need to make sure that they're able to swallow them whole. And so we went through some steps, and these are currently being validated in the field, but we're happy to share the current drafts for any of you that are interested. So this is just a little bit of an overview of what the granule counseling cards look like. There's advice and sort of a script for the healthcare worker on the back of each card, and illustrations that really go through each step. And we've included in here a few illustrations on how to express breast milk. And that's because in a few different settings, we find that expressing breast milk is not as common, and some women do require a little bit of instruction or support. So moving on from LPVR, the component of that is, of course, ritonavir, and we use this for both super boosting lopinavir ritonavir during TB treatment, but also for boosting the other unco-formulated protease inhibitors like atazanavir and darunavir. And for young children, we've previously had only the oral solution, which was not widely available, difficult to procure, and had a very short shelf life, something around 6 months. But more recently, the Innovator Company has developed a ritonavir oral powder. Now, this is available as 100 milligram in a packet, and at present, we can't reliably adjust the dose, but 100 milligrams is, again, this is an option now for those children that can't swallow the tablets whole. And we also have new generic versions of smaller tablets. So there's a generic company that has developed both a 25 milligram tablet and a 50 milligram tablet of ritonavir. Now, these have not yet been commercialized, and that's largely because programs haven't been very aware that this is available. And so we really want to spread the word that this is something that is an option, and the manufacturers are willing to make it. And I believe PEPFAR is actually also working with them to work on commercialization. And out of these two different formulations, the 25 milligram tablet has been prioritized, as we see this as the one that is probably the easiest to swallow for those that aren't able to swallow a larger tablet. The WHO now provides very clear guidance on dosing using the different formulations, the 25 milligram or the packet. And we would think that for those children who are slightly older, the 100 milligram or 25 milligram ritonavir tablet would be appropriate to super boost. But for infants and younger children, the solution or the powder may be required. And I mentioned previously that we tend to think about the NNRTI, the PI, or the integrase inhibitor, but we also have to pay attention to the NRTI backbone. Abacavir has been the preferred NRTI for pediatric first line since 2013, and in these years, we've really only had about half of the kids that are on first line are on abacavir. Now, there's a generic 30 milligram scored dispersible tablet that's widely available, and this is what countries have largely been using until now. But one of the issues with this is as our kids grow older, the pill burden also increases. So if you can see on the table, the pink table, as we look down the abacavir 3TC 60/30 column, we see that as weight increases, the number of tablets that children are taking significantly increase as well. And so this concern for high pill burden, particularly since we have an aging pediatric population, led to the advocacy and development of a double-strength abacavir 3TC tablet, which is the 120/60 milligram scored dispersible tablet. And you can see that on the right pink column. But as you can see, this double-strength tablet, because it's scored and dispersible, can still be used to dose down to the lowest weight band. And so for this reason, programs are now consolidating around this double strength tablet as opposed to the 60/30. And I mentioned TAF before, which again is a very new alternative for children. And this is just one of the abstracts on the safety and efficacy of TAF, emtricitabine, cobicistat as a booster, and alvategravir, or otherwise known as Genvoya, in virally suppressed kids through 96 weeks. So these were children, this was a switch study in children who were already suppressed, but they largely focused and had children enrolled that were greater than 6 years of age and greater than 25 kilos. So we do have a number of TAF-based formulations. I will say there are no generic formulations of, well, actually, no, that's not I take that back. There are some generic formulations of TAF, but there are a few that have been approved by the US FDA. It's not yet available. It's not available as a single drug, but in combination. So we have those, and I apologize that my slides, my markers didn't come out, but that several of these are approved in children that are 12 to 18, and there are a few of these that are actually also approved in those that are 6 years and up if weighing over 25 kilos. So there is an pediatric investigation plan to look at lower dose pediatric dispersible tablets of TAF, and hopefully that we'll see this in the near future. So I'm gonna move on now to talking about why we talk about consolidating or narrowing our options around just a few different formulations. And this is a little bit counterintuitive to the way pediatricians tend to think. We tend to like a lot of options, and so that we can individually tailor our treatment to the children and what they need, our patients and what they need. But as you can see here, when you look at it, if you look at the pediatric ARV market and the sort of demand for pediatric products, compared to adults, we have a wide array. So if we had 95 adults, pretty much everybody on this webinar, we'd probably take the same dosage, the same tablet. We can take the same once daily single tablet regimen. But if we even had just 5 pediatric patients, we may have multiple ages, multiple weight bands, and multiple developmental levels. And so that would require multiple formulations and regimens. So over time, we have expanded our arsenal against pediatric HIV with over 70 different formulations of pediatric ARVs. So this list here does not include any adult dosing, but includes only includes pediatric formulations. Now, several of these are no longer made or no longer recommended, but as you can see, they're over 70, and this gives us quite an array to still choose from. However, when it comes to generic products, and I want to stress that these are for generic products, not innovator products, generic products keep their prices low to make sure they're affordable for lower middle income countries by using economies of scale. And what that means is they need to produce a lot and sell a lot in order to make a profit. And at the end of the day, as much as we really, we want to make sure that we advocate for pediatric treatment, we still have to think and consider the business side and make sure that the drug companies will continue to find interest in this market. So this is just an illustrative example of what we call a minimum batch size. And what happens is generic companies figure out a price and a volume that they have to sell in order to make a profit. So they make their product at a certain cost, but they will only make a profit if they sell 10,000 packs, 5,000 packs. It varies from product to product, but they need to sell a minimum volume before they even produce a batch. So they won't even buy the active pharmaceutical ingredients or the ingredients, so to speak, and they won't even start the process until they have that order, because unlike some other commodities, drugs expire, so they don't want to create a batch that sits on the shelf and never gets purchased and expires. So when we have a wide array of pediatric formulations, it becomes very difficult to choose, and this is one of the reasons why we're trying to consolidate or reduce the number of formulations in use, because as you can see here, again, the pediatric population is shrinking, and while that's a very good thing, what that means is when countries or programs are ordering from that wide array of different formulations, there aren't enough orders to actually fill a minimum batch size. So, for example, Botswana may place an order for 5,000 packs, but they'll have to sit and wait until all of these other countries order enough that it all adds up to the minimum batch size. And so given this situation, there really was a need to sort of optimize the formulary and look at how do we make sure that the pediatric ARV market is sustainable. So this brings me to the optimal what we call the optimal pediatric ARV formulary. So this is a formulary that simplifies the selection and procurement of pediatric ARVs. So we are, the WHO provides normative guidance on what are the best drugs to provide first and second line regimens for children, and the formulary provides guidance and recommendations on the exact formulation that's needed. So this started back in 2011 with the recognition that we had sort of fragmentation and we had this issue of not meeting minimum batch sizes. And so in 2011, a group of experts convened to select those products that would be needed to sort of simplify formularies while yet delivering all first and second line regimens across all age groups. Now, as WHO guidelines change, the formulary also has to sort of remain a living document. And most recently in July 2018, there's a new optimal formulary and also what we call the limited use list that was published alongside the WHO 2018 recommendations for pediatric ART. When it comes to selecting the pediatric sort of products and those that are optimal for the formulary, we go back to sort of that checklist of criteria, and a sort of a similar list was developed for the selection of these of the products that are included on the formulary. So this includes those that are WHO recommended and therefore safety and efficacy have been established, that have a quality, at least one quality assured product available, that's user friendly, meaning it's easy for healthcare workers to prescribe, easy for caregivers to administer, and supports adherence in children, and also optimizes the supply chain. So it's easy to transport, easy to store, and easy to distribute. We also want the maximum dosing flexibility, which is often why we go for a lower dose of a medication that can be dosed across all weight bands. And again, comparative cost we've included here as sort of the last consideration. It shouldn't be the deciding factor in the selection of a drug, given the low numbers of pediatric patients that most countries have. But if we're deciding across similar drugs or similar drug formulations, it should be considered. Now, I sort of explained the optimal formulary and briefly mentioned the limited use list, but these are the definitions of the two. The optimal formulary is including the minimum number of ARV formulations that would be needed to provide all currently recommended, preferred and alternative first and second line regimens for infants and children, and we've also included in this infant prophylaxis for PMTCT. Now, this will probably serve the vast majority of children, but there still are those special circumstances, such as TB treatment or neonatal treatment, that may not be a product that is high in demand, but we still don't want to forget about those kids. So this is where the limited use formulary came together. And these are those formulations that the drugs are actually included in the WHO guidelines, but may be needed for a very limited time, such as the case of neonatal treatment, or in very low volumes, as is the case of third line. And I do want to stress here that what we're really focusing on is the pediatric formulations. So we don't really include consideration of the adult ARV formulations, even though we see more harmonization with adults and we see younger children now able to use adult formulations. So our 2018, the most recent optimal formulary, actually contains only 8 products. And if you can look at the first 3, AZT oral liquid, nevirapine 50 milligram tablet, and the nevirapine oral liquid, these 3 are actually just for postnatal prophylaxis or neonatal treatment. So we're not thinking about use of these for the majority of the population, which actually gets us down to 5 products. So there are only 5 formulations that are really needed to deliver all pediatric first and second line regimens that are recommended by the WHO at this time. So that includes the LPVR 100 milligram, 25 milligram heat stable tablet. And again, this can be used in children weighing more than 10 kilos as long as they're able to swallow it whole. But we've also included now the new solid oral dosage forms, which are the granules or the pellets that could be used for younger children. AZT3TC as a 60-30 milligram dispersible tablet, for second line, or in those cases where abacavir can't be used, and then the abacavir 3TC 120/60 dispersible scored tablet. And as I mentioned earlier, this tablet is sort of double strength from what was previously available, but it's what we're moving towards, given that it reduces the pill burden for older children and can still be used to dose down to the youngest children. We've also included in here a raltegravir chewable scored tablet. There was a 100 milligram scored tablet and a 25 milligram tablet, but for the sake of dosing flexibility, especially since we really need to have sort of better treatment options for the youngest infants, and we're moving towards having other options for older children, we chose to kind of consolidate our selection around the 25 milligram tablet. I want to point out here that there's a note at the bottom about dolutegravir containing regimens, being the first line preferred treatment. At the time that we did this, the 50 milligram adult tablets were approved for use in children weighing 25 kilos or more, though since then there's been new information that allowed us to reduce the weight limit to 20 kilos. Now, when the dosing and the formulations are confirmed for the lower weight bands, this is definitely something that's going to be revised. And as I mentioned, this is a living list, and we need to make sure that it reflects what's currently available. This brings us to the limited use products, and this actually has quite a few more. It's twice more than we really have for the optimal formulary for treatment, but this includes, again, those products that would be needed for special circumstances, and this gives an opportunity, as opposed to focusing on that long laundry list of different formulations, for programs and procurement bodies to really focus on a set number of products to make sure that they are available and accessible to countries. So this includes the LPVR oral liquid, which again we may need in some circumstances, but given that it's so unpleasant and so difficult to scale up, this is something that we see being replaced by better formulations. 3TC oral liquid at this point would really only be needed for neonatal treatment, as abacavir would be, an abacavir a single, which is not, in combination with 3TC, would be needed for the duration of TB treatment if we're providing a triple nuke option. Though that said, again, that's probably the last option we choose, but that's kind of, in some cases, what we have available. Darunavir, the 75 milligram tablet, is also included for third-line regimens in children 3 years and above, and there are actually many different formulations of Darunavir tablets. It's available in many strengths, but here we really consolidated around the 75 milligram tablet, given its size and ability to dose across a wider range of weight bands. The ritonavir tablet, powder, and powder were also included here. As I had previously mentioned, we chose the 25 milligram tablet to prioritize given its size, and the powder we've also included for those children that can't swallow the tablets. I didn't mention this when we were going through the different options, but we don't want to forget that there's also the option of atazanavir as a capsule. And so this is considered an alternative second line in combination with ritonavir. Now, we didn't use this widely, given that there weren't suitable formulations of ritonavir for younger children. But if we introduce the 25 milligram, we're hoping that this may be a suitable alternative. And there are manufacturers making a 200 milligram capsule. This brings us to AZT3TC nevirapine, the dispersible scored tablet, which we've included on here because we want to phase this out. And yet, at the end of 2017, a quarter of all children on treatment were still on this formulation. And if you go to some countries, you'll see that the majority of kids haven't moved because this is easy to take. This is widely available. It's inexpensive, and it's a 3-in-1 formulation. Though that said, we can say that in a large number of those children, the formulation and the drugs that are included don't work anymore. So this is why we're trying to phase this out of use, but really it may be needed in those special circumstances when boosted PIs or integrase inhibitors are not available. Efavirenz is sort of similar here. The 200 milligram tablet, again, would be used in special circumstances, but as we see increasing NNRTI resistance, we're really trying to move away from all NNRTIs. And lastly, we've included the raltegravir granules for suspension, and again, this is just for neonatal treatment. So this is, this limited use is really what we mean is it's limited use in terms of time, in that it will be either phased out of use or it would be needed for a short amount of time. I see we're sort of getting to the end of our hour, so I want to quickly go through transition planning. I think programs sometimes get tired of all the recommendation changes because it is a lot of work to change your guidelines, to change practices of the healthcare workers, to change your dosing guidance. And we really want to plan ahead. This also includes sort of planning for your ARV supplies. And so in addition to the formulary, there was also a transition brief that was developed to go through the different considerations when you transition to a new or different or optimal pediatric ARV formulary. There are obviously the clinical considerations that we have to go through, which includes which patients will be eligible, what kind of dosing and administration guidance is needed, how we transition from suboptimal regimens, what are the age-appropriate regimens and formulations, and how do we transition as children grow. You also have to think about the supply chain and procurement, because these drugs don't appear in the pharmacy by magic. It actually takes anywhere from 6 months to a year or longer for pediatric formulations to get to a country. They have to be, there's a group that will quantify for how much they need, will think over over a time span what they will need of each formulation. They'll have to place that order. It will have to be manufactured. So it really does require quite a bit of planning in advance to make sure that these formulations are available. And lastly, I'm bringing up monitoring and evaluation, and there's been quite a bit of discussion around toxicity monitoring and pharmacovigilance, particularly around dolutegravir. But I want to stress that for children, they're exposed to these drugs for much longer, and we have limited experience, especially compared to the, sort of the high volume of adults. And so I think this is of critical importance for children, and there is some guidance around this. There's a pediatric ARV working group that has a sort of a toolkit for pediatric drug formulations, and this is one resource that's available with some guidance on this. And so as we talk about transition, what we're really trying to do is think about taking all of these regimens that are currently in use by children and transitioning them to one of three regimens: abacavir 3TC and lopinavir ritonavir for those under 20 kilos, abacavir 3TC and dolutegravir for those between 20 and 30 kilos, and then harmonizing with adults for those that are 30 kilos or more. But within this group, we also have to remember that we are also thinking through lopinavir ritonavir syrup or pellets or granules for the younger infants and children, as well as the pediatric tablets for those that are able to swallow tablets. So in reality, I think the pediatric transition planning tends to be a little bit more complicated, because here we're actually talking about 4 transitions, in addition to thinking through what would be needed as children age and grow. So there is some transition guidance that's available in the WHO guidelines. There is a table that sort of helps figure out, based on the regimen that a patient is on and their weight, what would their optimal regimen for transition be, and then what are some of the considerations around that. So for example, you can see here the AZT3TC nevirapine or AZT3TC efavirenz and abacavir 3TC nevirapine, those 3 regimens. These can be transitioned to the new regimens, though one of the considerations that programs do deal with is thinking through whether or not there needs to be documentation of viral load suppression. And so again, based on the availability of viral load, that is something to think about, though in many cases, and in the WHO recommendation is to not let viral load be a delay or cause a delay. If there's lack of, or there's limited viral load coverage, it shouldn't lead to the delay in transition to optimal regimens. So similarly, for abacavir 3-TC efavirenz, we can change to the optimal regimen, though there's some consideration for those that are stable on this regimen. This was the preferred regimen for older children from 2013 onwards. And if they're stable, they can, there's consideration of maybe they should remain on this until they reach 20 kilos, or unless there's concern about treatment failure. And lastly, for those that are on abacavir 3-TC LPVR, again, this is a preferred regimen for those that don't have dosing or formulations for dolutegravir. And again, we can transition these children to the optimal, one of the 3 optimal choices as well. So in terms of considerations in this sort of laundry list on the bottom, we do have to think about viral load availability because, again, we can't forget about the NRTI backbone, especially for those on AZT. In some cases, for the 50% that are on abacavir, we're making a single drug switch. And so we want to really be careful around that. But at the same time, we know that the third drug, either the LPVR or dolutegravir, is more potent, has a higher genetic barrier to resistance, and therefore there's actually more sort of confidence in switching these children as long as viral load can be monitored. We're really trying to move towards simplified recommendations as well. So I think this is important for healthcare workers on the ground. But given the fact that this transition takes time, we also want to think about which patients should have clinical priority, which will benefit the most from optimizing their formulations, because we also have to use up existing stocks. As I mentioned, this is a long process, so there are many of the older formulations or legacy formulations available, and these need to be used up in order not to waste them. And lastly, we have to think about the formulations that are accessible in country, which is why I'm trying to mention, the distinction between generic products as well as innovator products, because based on the income status of a country, not all the generic products may be available. And I actually would like to hear, it would be great to hear from some of the participants what their experience has been. So very quickly, because we're running out of time, I just wanted to give an update on sort of where we are with the pipeline products and those that we're looking forward to in the future. Now we have dolutegravir 50 milligrams in TLD for those that are 20 kilos or 30 kilos. And we have now there has been constraints about supply capacity, but there is now increased capacity for the pellets and the granules. So this is much less of a constraint in scaling up. There's a 4-in-1 granule formulation, which would be a complete regimen in a granular formulation. And this we're anticipating that this would start to be available perhaps in 2020, at some point in 2020. And again, I have these timelines on here because the day a drug is approved is not necessarily the day it's available in country. It has to be, the company has to file it. It takes about 6 months for a priority review, but then it takes time for the manufacturers to commercialize it, for orders to be placed, for deliveries to be made, and for distribution. So I kind of give it a wide window in terms of availability in country. There's also, again, there's work going on with the dolutegravir 5 milligram dispersible tablet and a 10 milligram dispersible scored tablet. Though I do have to add this caveat that all timelines are subject to change. So there's nothing that's sort of certain in the drug development space, and we really want to make sure that we're not waiting or delaying because we think something better is coming down the line. Things do happen, and things that we don't expect do happen, and so I think we also have to look at what's in front of us and move accordingly. So with that, I thank you for your time and your patience in getting through this hour. Shanti, I don't know if there's any time for some discussion or questions, if there are any.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nandita. Yes, we have a few questions and I'll allow you to take them. I think you've answered one of them, but I'll go ahead and pose it. So the question is, what is the global timeline, or how soon do you think pediatric dosing form for DTG will be available? I think your last slide spoke to that, but you may want to add. And then the second question that I have that has come in is, I know that point of care testing is available for viral load testing for adults? Is this technology validated and in use for children? And I have one comment for you. Thank you very much, Doctor, for a very informative presentation. Well done. So any comment on the two questions and the comment?
Sorry, thank you very much. No, so in terms of, I'm going to go back, I think that question of DTG for peds comes up quite often. And I actually did have a few slides in here on some of the data that was presented on DaliaTen using a 5 milligram dispersible tablet that was at the AIDS conference. And I apologize for not including it. It sort of would end up being a lengthy discussion. And partly I want to stress this, the idea that timelines are subject to change. So we do have to look to the future, and I think this will be a very valuable option for children and really will change the space in that it will allow for more harmonization with adults. That said, so there are two studies that are going on right now, and I think Martina Penazzato from the WHO is also on the line if she wants to speak to this. Shanti, I'm not sure if you're able to unmute her. So the P1093 study is the pharmacokinetic study looking at the dosing and the safety of a 5 milligram dispersible tablet. Now they're using the same tablet across the age groups, and they've and there was data published or presented at the IAS conference on the use of this, and I believe it was down to 3 kilos, but Martina, correct me if I'm wrong. And there's also a second study, the Odyssey study, that's looking at the effectiveness of DaliaTen Revere in first line and second line. And it was this this study that provided the evidence that was needed to approve the use of DaliaTen Revere 50 milligrams in children down to 20 kilos. So the 5 milligram dispersible tablet is what's being developed by the innovator company ViiV. All the cohorts for 1093 have been enrolled, and we're anticipating that towards the end of this year, the company will be filing with the FDA for approval. Now, as I mentioned, this is sort of a process that, again, we expect the company to file. There's a pretty stringent review process, but this is, again, a priority drug, and we usually, in terms of how long it takes to get to an approval, if everything is perfect and in a perfect world, it should take about 6 months. But again, there's always delays. We're never 100% sure, though. There's been a lot of effort to sort of focus on this and increase collaboration and transparency into what's happening to make sure that we don't kind of have these surprises. But it still takes time for the approval. It takes time for for countries to update their guidance. And so this is why there's like a pretty wide window here in terms of the availability. And I have to say, I've been burned before by promising something is around the corner and then having to wait years for it. So that said, I do think this is pretty far along, and we're very, I think there's a lot of anticipation and excitement for this. But in the meantime, what I would recommend is not sort of waiting to switch to optimal formulations. Know that this is coming, but we need to optimize those regimens for those kids while we can. And there's a second project. This is the Clinton Health Access Initiative in collaboration with Unitaid and the innovator company ViiV is working on the generic product simultaneously as the 5 milligram dispersible tablet is being developed. And so this will be a 10 milligram score tablet, and it should follow closely behind the approval of the innovator product. And I hope that answers the question. Martina, I'm not sure if you want to add anything.
I'm not sure.
She is, sorry, I apologize. I don't know if she's if you were able to see her.
Yeah, yeah, I haven't seen her.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So I I apologize, but I'll go ahead with the second question, which was about point of care viral load testing. And the question was, can this be used in pediatrics? And I will just, I think the answer is yes. I think that there are also point of care tests for EID in addition to viral load, but absolutely, this is an option for kids in those countries that are introducing point of care. And lastly, I again thank you all for your patience and your interest. If there are any additional questions or comments, I'm still on the line.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Dr. Nandita. At this point, I'll bring the webinar to an end. So on behalf of my director, Mr. Derek Spring, and the PANCAP partnership, I wish to extend a really big thank you to you, Dr. Nandita, for a comprehensive and insightful presentation that has provided us with the latest evidence and normative guidance on how best to manage our HIV-infected children. Once again, this webinar is a collaboration between PANCAP and the Pan American Health Organization. Thanks to PAHO, Dr. Giovanni Rabasi, I see you on the webinar, for collaborating with us to bring the latest evidence from the 10th IES. Thank you, colleagues, for participating. I trust that you've gained new knowledge, which you will use to strengthen pediatric HIV management in the region. To wrap up, as a reminder, the webinar was recorded and will be shared on PANCAP's website. Please complete the post-webinar evaluation. We'll highly appreciate your feedback. I encourage you to stay engaged with the regional response. Follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, and visit PANCAP website for more information on the Caribbean regional response. Thank you all very much and have a good afternoon.